Hi, my name is David Lee, and today I'd like to talk about Distributed Application Runtime, or DAPR. So let's talk about what DAPR is actually for, right? And I'm going to start with a problem statement that, when we're trying to build applications, such as microservices, we are required as developers to make several considerations. How do you ensure communication between services? And how do you ensure, that you are able to get to your dependencies? How do you keep up with specific cloud services dependencies, right? Such as Service Bus, right? Because, if you need to do any kind of pubs up, then you really need to learn about the Azure Service Bus as well as the SDK so that you can incorporate that into your code. And then what about security, right? Is there any connection strings? And how do you ensure best practices in keeping, secrets like that, connection string secrets, safe? How do you monitor the health of your application? How do you ensure your application is resilient, right? Because let's say you're trying to connect to, again, the Azure Service Bus. How do you, make sure that you account for those connection, right? Runtime connections, and like you're unable to connect to those dependencies. So that's a lot to consider. And so with Dapper, right, we can think of Dapper as providing us with the building blocks for us to use as a way to abstract ourselves from those infrastructure concerns, and so we can be very focused on writing our business logic. So with Dapper, there's this component for service invocation, right? Where if we have service-to-service communication, now we don't have to understand how to discover those services or look up the actual endpoints, right? The framework, or Dapper's building block for service invocation, will provide us with the tools or components to help us do that. Related to state management of how we can query or persist data to the backend, right? In particular, those key value pairs, the state management component is going to help us take care of that for us, right? The other thing is secret management. So, how do we get or set secrets and adhere to the best practices, and also kind of ensure that we don't check in secrets into our source code, right? So the secret management component is going to help us with that. PubSub component, so how do we broker messages between the applications? And if we go back to our example of Service Bus, now we're abstracted away from that. We don't have to learn how to code Azure Service Bus. We can just use one single abstraction of code and be able to push messages, whether it's Service Bus or RabbitMQ, whatever we decide, right? We're abstracted away from those concrete implementation. The other thing about it is the input and output binding, right? So that we can get to an event-driven architecture, because the bindings will allow our microservice to respond to, for example, incoming events, such as from Twilio or SMS, without having to add or configure, the Twilio or learn about the Twilio SDK, right? So that's a big plus. And so right now, let's take a look at an example where we're going to get hands-on, get our hands dirty, to do a PubSub example with Dapper. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to install the Dapper CLI. Then we're going to create a .NET Web API project with the Dapper NuGet package installed. Then we're going to go to the Azure portal to add Azure Service Bus. And then we're going to write some API and some PubSub code and configure the appropriate settings so that we can push messages to the Azure Service Bus. And then we're going to run a quick demo. So let's do that next. All right. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to the Dapper website And there's a little install the Dapper Cli command, right? So because I'm on Windows, I'm able to select the Windows tab and just be able to find a PowerShell command that I can just copy and run on my local machine to install the Dapper Cli. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to paste that command, and it should automatically download, create the Dapper folder on my C drive, download and basically install the CLI on my machine. So we'll let it run for a quick moment. All right, looks like it's done. So just to make sure that the Dapper is in my command line, what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a new PowerShell session. I'm just going to, so if I just run the Dapper command, then it will show that I have Dapper installed. Now, this is actually still not done, because what we need to do next, and I'm going to go ahead and go back to the website, is to initialize the Dapper in our local development environment. And what this does is, because Dapper actually runs alongside your application using a sidecar pattern, that means there are some dependencies that is required on your site from a local development environment. The other thing that the Dapper will do for you is there are certain containers that it already will install by default for you, like the Redis container. So you could immediately use that as a way to store local state, right? Or use it as a message broker. So several things that it will do when you try to initialize it. So I'm going to do, going to go back, I'm going to clear out, and I'm going to call Dapper init, DAPR, init, sorry, can't spell. So what it's doing right now, it is downloading the components. And so what it's saying for me is, hey, do a Docker PS to check that if the containers are running. And Dapper components, as we can see here, are running. So that is good news. The last command that I'm just going to run, the APR, is I'm going to check the version to make sure that I do have the latest version, which is 1.7.2. I'm sorry, 1.7.1 is the CLI, which is the version that I'm actually interested in. All right, so up next, we will go ahead and launch Visual Studio, and we will create a new project. All right, so we're going to create a new project. We're going to select the ASP.NET Core Web API because we're going to create an API. I am going to create this in a demo folder. I'm going to select that, and I'm going to name my project Dapper API. I'm going to put them in the same directory. And I'm going to enable Docker here. I'm just going to check my settings to make sure everything looks good. I'm going to hit create to create my project. All right, so cool. So first thing first is you can see that we have generated the default weather forecast project, and that's what I'm going to be using. But before doing anything, my preference is always to make sure my NuGet packages are all up to date. All right, so that looks good. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to find a NuGet package for my project, and I'm going to copy a name over here. Is the Dapper ASP.NET Core NuGet package is what I need. And I'm going to install it. All right, cool. So it looks like that has been installed. And so in order to use Dapper in my project, there is a one-line command that I do need to run. And I'm going to do builder.services at Dapper client. Okay, cool. So this will enable Dapper on my project. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to invoke the Dapper client. Let me check one thing real quick. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the weather forecast as a model that I'm going to do a HTTP put command, and that will invoke some code to put this as a message inside Azure Service Bus. All right, so to keep this thing simple, I'm just going to name it temp weather forecast. Just make sure that looks right. Okay, very good. And the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the weather forecast controller. I don't think I need that. And I need to inject the Dapper client. Okay, let's just see how. Let's just make sure that I'm using that namespace, and I'm going to create an assigned field for that guy. All right, so I am actually going to change the default HTTP to HTTP put command. Call it add. Same task. Just gonna say put here weather forecast, and let's just do a log message on debug. Invoke. Just lazy to type. API. Okay, looks good. And I'm going to do. All right, so this is where we start to see the different capabilities of Dapper client. And there's several commands like doing health checks, doing doing state management, and many other things. But what we're interested to do for this particular session is we are interested to publish events, right? So nothing around this particular command indicates that we are using Azure Service Bus, right? Because, and in fact, we don't have to. And all we are concerned with is, this is a wrapper, right? And I'm calling this command in order to publish some messages to a message broker. So let's make some of the parameters configurable, but let's talk about what's the parameter, right? So pub/sub name is really referring to the component or the service that you will be configuring later on, right? And then topic name is the name of the topic or the queue in Azure Service Bus. So for those two parameters, what I'm going to do, I'm going to inject them by setting them in the configuration. So, right, I'm not going to hard code them. So what we'll do is we'll call it configuration. Oops. Pub sub name configuration pub sub topic, and for the model, we're going to send in the weather forecast, or the message rather. Okay, so a little bit hard to read, so just gonna, yep. All right. So this is the extent of our code as developers. Obviously, this is not done yet, and we really need to configure where we're going to be publishing it to, right? So the good news is this is all done through a configuration process, and it's not code, right? So in production, we can think about it as, hey, if I need to switch out my message broker, it's a matter of configuration, right? Rather than code. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to create a folder called components, and this is where we will be putting in the configuration for for use with Dapper, right? So before we do anything more, what I'm going to do is to bring up the documentation again. And so on the documentation page, we can see that there's actually a whole bunch of component specifications, right? And those component specifications are really YAML configuration that tells us, what the YAML configuration for different components will look like, right? So if you're familiar with Docker, right, this is Docker, Kubernetes, YAML configuration. This is a very familiar way. So we are interested in the pub sub broker component specs, and so a lot of the configuration or pub sub configuration are listed here. But what we're interested for our session today is Azure Service Bus, and so this is the configuration for Azure Service Bus, right? And we can see that there is the name of the particular component. So if we go back to our code earlier, right, we can recall that the first parameter is is this component name called Service Bus -pub sub, right? Obviously, I'm going to name mine differently. And we can also notice that there's this concept of namespace. So within Dapper, right, namespace is really a way to kind of isolate your components. So components within or services components defined within a namespace can talk to each other, right? But if they're not in the same namespace, then they cannot. So this is something that you want to take note of. Other than that, we can see that there's a type, there's a version, and then the metadata really speaks to the different configuration that you can do, right? Obviously, connection string is an important requirement, but there are other configuration that we can do. So with that said, I'm going to go back to my project. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create I'm going to create a component I'm just going to call it popsub.yaml. Yep, and as you can imagine, I'm not going to start writing that from the beginning. So I actually already have a configuration, but let's talk about it, right? So what I've done is I've named my component for the Azure Service Bus, weather-sender. It's going to be in the default namespace. Now, in the docs, Dapper docs, you will also kind of notice that the namespace could also be like dev or production, right? So that's one way to use it. So for the connection string, I'm actually going to be using. I will not hard code my connection string in my YAML, right? So that's a bad practice for local development. So that's why I'm using a secret key reference technique to reference my connection string to my Azure Service Bus. You can also notice that I'm actually disabling the entity management because I already have created, or I would have created, my topics in my Azure Service Bus, and so I don't need Dapper to do that for me, right? The other thing is if we do want to use this functionality, that means the connection string, right? If you're familiar with Azure Service Bus, you can define policies for reading, sending, managing the service bus topics. So if you do not do this, then you need more permissions, right? Not just the sender permission in our case, right? So I don't want to give it too much permission, so I rather do it on my side and then just disable this particular functionality. But let's go back to the secrets, right? So for the connection string, I'm going to pull it from something called the Contoso secret store. Now, let's go back to the specs again. And let's take a look at secret stores, okay? So there is a few generic way that we can pull the connection string, but I have actually chosen to do it through a file, okay? So this is the configuration for it, and it's pointing to a JSON file. So again, let me go back to the project. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a file, and I'm going to name it local secrets.yml, and I probably want to name this YML as well. That's the file structure, and I'm going to copy that over here. All right, so Contoso secret store is right here, and if you go back right to the popsub YAML, right, it's referencing Contoso secret store, and so the secret key reference is trying to reference this line called SB connection string. All right, so if we go back to local secrets, we're saying that, hey, in the root directory, there should be a secrets.json. So what we'll do is we will create a new item. Let me just see. All right, so we're going to call it secrets.json, and if we recall that this is the name that we're going to be referencing. All right, so cool. So now we're ready for setting the connection string to our Azure Service Bus, And what I'm going to do next is going to this portal. Right, so I've already created my service bus and name it EK David Lee. But here I'm going to create a queue. Let me just and let's name the queue called weather. With all the default settings. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a policy for only sending messages. Okay. And so if I click on it, I can actually copy the connection string and go back to my project. Okay. So from a technical perspective, right, you should do a git ignore on secrets.json, right? And so let's say a different developer picked up your project. You know, they could have they could create the secrets.json on their site, and that's all they need to do, and you know, put in the appropriate connection string, right? So secrets, this connection string should never be checked in, but you can check in the local secrets. You can check in the pubsub YAML. All right, so let me just do a quick build here to make sure everything builds. Okay, and so now we are ready to run this solution. So I'm just gonna cd into the demo folder, gonna cd into the Dapper API. Awesome. All right, so this is where we can run the command for running our Dapper with that sidecar as a sidecar in our application, and then we can test out the API. So the expectation is once we launch the project, we're going to be able to invoke a RESTful call to the @weather forecast, and it will then publish the event. Oh, and this reminds me that we are actually missing two things: the pubsub name and the pubsub topic in our app settings. So let's go ahead and do that. So the pubsub name would probably be weather center, right? And let me just and the pubsub topic would be weather, right? Because if you recall, when we created our topic in Azure Service Bus, we name it weather. Okay, cool. So just making sure everything builds right, and we should be good to go. Let's go back to the command line. All right. So what I am going to do is I'm going to call dapper.run. So I'm just going to name my service. So this -a is just a name for your service, right? We can just call it Dapper API, perhaps. And now we need to specify, we need to do a -d to specify the folder where all the YAML configurations are located. So relative to where we are right now, yeah, we just call it components here. So they're all in the components folder. And then we need to do a .NET run command to run our project. All right, so that should be all we need to do. All right, so I hit enter just now, and initially we have the Dapper components running as a sidecar, and now we have our code running, and our code is listening on 7291. So this is something that we need to take note of. So I'm just gonna copy an existing command that I have. Oops, and actually what I need to do before I run it is I need to declare my object. Right, so if we recall, and the DTO, or the model, has a date and has a temp, right? So let's say the date is 2022, May 10th, and temp is, let's call it 10 or 70 degrees, whatever, right? I may have used the wrong way to declare an object, partial object. Okay, so this is the right way to declare a partial object. Now I can paste in my method and do a put to the endpoint, but I do need to use 7291 as the port number. Okay. All right, so looks like it went through, but we should go back to the code here. And looks good. If there's an error, right, it actually will show up here. So, but this is kind of telling us that everything looks good. So what we'll do, we'll go back, and what we will do is go back to overview here. Gonna go to the Explorer. We're gonna try to peek on the queue, and voila, we got our message. And if we look on our message, right, we do see that our message body is wrapped around the Dapper structure, right? So we have our date, we have our temp 70, and then we also have some other information as well. All right, so this shows the kind of the power of using Dapper, right, as part of our code. And again, just to show from a development perspective, developers don't have to really choose any components. They can use any components they like, configured locally. So, if you decide, let's say your local development, you're pretty happy with RabbitMQ, but when you go to the cloud, Azure Service Bus actually looks better for you. Then the your platform guys, or the folks managing your cloud could then choose to use that instead, right? Obviously, there's consequences, other considerations, but this kind of shows the power of Dapper and on how flexible and robust it is, right? And so hopefully we've kind of learned a little bit about Dapper, and that helps you. All right, thank you so much.